They were amazed in many times because when I bought things, I wasn't looking at them for the monetary value or anything like that. I was looking at them for the aesthetic, artistic value. Like the gourds up here, I went on a bicycle with Carol Beckwith, who's a photographer and friend of mine. We went on a bicycle through northern Cameroon, and every village we stopped. And we went behind the houses and looked for the old milk gourds. You see over there, there's a photo of a woman carrying one of these, taken by Carol. And so they were laughing because they said, "Here comes the man to buy our trash," because I would go out behind the house and look at the old gourds that leaked, and they couldn't figure out why I wanted them because you couldn't put milk in them. So, but I just was looking at them for the repairs, the beauty of the design, the patina, and I knew that this was real art. People, that's what I used to say to people, why is it that the rest of the world has art and everything from Africa is called artifacts? This is the real art. This is the real art. It's not to put on your wall. It's not to sit on the table. It's these beautiful items that they put their creativity and efforts in, and it should be appreciated for what it is, a work of art. Instead of going painting something from looking at these flowers or something, this is real art. It's used, it's part of the people, part of the culture. So, when I first went to Turkana, and I was just buying one or two things, people accepted me. I had no problem, but when I opened African Heritage and I went back and I started buying huge volumes of things, then it completely changed. Because then they saw me as a source of money. They no longer saw me as just a friend coming along to look at their things. But anyway, I never had any difficulty. But you see, in those days, there weren't very many collectors going around. You couldn't use Visa cards. You couldn't use checkbooks. You couldn't do transfers because where I went, there was no banks. And so you had to carry money only. It was difficult. If you look at my website, you see all the different categories. Like musicians, for instance, I had many bands after the way I started the festivals was I had two festivals in Nairobi, one from Madagascar and one from Nigeria. And for Nigeria, I drove all around through every part of Nigeria and made collections. And during the All African Trade Fair in Nairobi, I showed those things. And we had the first show in Nairobi with all African models. Before that, there were mostly European models and Asian models. I started the first models, all African models in my shows, all African bands, and totally African. So the first show we had was in 1972, January, with all African models and band. And then I had a band from Zambia. They were Zambian and Kenyan, called Musiotunya. Musiotunya means smoke that thunders, and the name of Victoria Falls. And they were a very good band, and they played at the first African Heritage shows. And then the Hotel Intercontinental came along and said, that's where I had the show in 1972, would you do a show for us every month? We want you to do a festival every month. So I said, well, I'll think about that. And then I realized it would take me a whole year to do the kind of festival I wanted to do. So I finally said to them, I can only do one a year. So that's how it became the African Heritage Nights. The African Heritage Nights used to be the biggest event in Nairobi every year. And people lined up, and we sold all the tickets always, and sometimes we'd have to extend for another night. But then the Kenya government came to me and said, could we take your show to Europe to promote tourism to Africa and to Kenya? So I realized then, after doing one tour that they sponsored with the Bomas of Kenya and African Heritage, that I needed my own musicians and part of the troupe. So I started looking for musicians, and that's when I went over to the Conservatoire of Music, and I ran into somebody named Job Seda, and he'd been playing in Black Savage and another group in Nairobi. And I tapped him on the shoulder and said, I'm Alan Donovan, and I'm looking for musicians. And that afternoon, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd moved into my gallery. He had all the band, he had everybody there, and that was the African Heritage Band. We had the first concert the night before I left for my second tour of Europe, and it was a big sellout. They were fabulous, and people were dancing in the aisles at the City Hall where we had it. Anyway, that was the first band, was the African Heritage Band. And some of those people, like Job Seda became Ayub Ogata. He went on his own tours. Samite is still in America, still touring around the United States. They both came out of the African Heritage Band. Francis Njoroge, who played in Malindi for many years, he's now formed another group. So those were the first musicians associated with African Heritage. And then they broke up and they all went different ways. And then I had a female group, musically speaking. Joy Mboya, Susan Matiba, Susan Gachukia. And Susan actually married Guido from the African Heritage Band, so we sort of meshed into a new group with Guido and Suzanne, musically speaking. And after musically speaking, I had people playing in the garden at African Heritage, many groups. And one of those groups was the group that formed Jabali Africa. And they were playing in my garden. In fact, Asakoi came to me one day and said something about, have you ever been to African Heritage Garden? I said, yes, I own it. Anyway, they were, I didn't have time always to get to the gigs on Saturday and Sunday, but those gigs were so popular. We always had the fire department come by and shut us down because we had too many people on the streets and everywhere on Saturday afternoon or Sunday. And then I had another group, Taffy Dancers, started by Rodido, who's a very talented dancer and musician that I still work with today. And he traveled to Europe with me and South Africa. And then the last tour that I made was in 1995 to Europe. That was Jabali Africa. And we toured 11 cities with a luxury bus and full of instruments and costumes and plants and lighting, and even murals that we put in every venue in every city. We turned it into Kenya. We had murals that we rolled down on the walls so we could create the beaches and the mountains and make it look like Kenya. And we had Kenyan food, we had our own chefs, we had Kenya hairdressers. So it was a massive undertaking, and it was sponsored by Lufthansa, who was probably our biggest sponsor of all time, and Hotel Intercontinental. So that worked very well because at least we knew we were going to have beds because we had a hotel sponsor, and we would have air tickets because we had an air sponsor. So I had other airlines like Sabina, Air France, and then other hotel groups like Hilton. So this is how we did the tours mainly, was to get an airline and a hotel group to sponsor us. And so then we played in hotels, we played in nightclubs and so on. And I left Jabali Africa in New York after our tour. That was in 23 years ago, believe it or not, when these kids were, these guys were kids. And that's was the last major tour that I did. Then we have a new musician that studied under Ayub Bugada that started with a group called Juakali Drummers, was it? Juakali Drummers, I think. And then they traveled all over America and went to Brazil, and he went to school in Italy. They came back and he set up a group with the older guys called Slum Drummers, and that group traveled around as well. But it was mostly all percussion. But Pampione decided he wanted to become totally different from everybody else and make all his own instruments based on old African instruments. Some were thousands of years old. So he started making instruments. The first he made his own thumb piano from a light globe, and then he made it out of a gourd, and then he built a harp attached to the piano and a drum all together, and so he just keeps on producing instruments. So it's a totally different sound. And he's the last that has had concerts here at African Heritage House. In fact, he had one last week. What you're saying is a lot has been lost. And it's true. Like the textiles have become so labor intensive that the beautiful textiles that I sit on here and that have been the inspiration for many, many designers in New York, Paris, London, they're all dying because people now wear Chinese fabrics or used clothes from America. And so the textile industry, which I think was the greatest gift Africa had for the world, is the textiles and the music and the sculpture. And it's all dying. And now I only hear music from Africa that's basically the same as what you can hear in New York, or it's no longer African to me. So that's what you can do, is Africanize yourselves. Well, American culture, I don't even know what it is, but I'm so glad I came to Africa 50 years ago, and I could experience cultures that didn't have any outside influence, that were doing their own designs and their own music and their own dance. And it was thrilling, especially the textiles, the hand-woven, hand-printed textiles are some of the best designs in the world, and also some of the weaving is the most complicated weaving in the world in Ghana. And now it's all disappearing. So what I could buy or what I could find even 5 years ago, you can't find now.
A good friend is the one you can count on at 8.